Okay, our learning is Lila Nishmas Mendel Mariam Bas Kalman Ruvain. Her neshama should have an aliyah. We are at Kuf Yud Beis Amud Beis, and right at the top, Umi Amar Rav Yochanan Hachi. So second line in on the daf, and the first full paragraph, like the second paragraph on the English side. Umi Amar Rav Yochanan Hachi. So let's just quickly remind ourselves what was happening. There was a machlokas between the Rabbanan and Rabbi Yehuda about switching shoes. Remember, they had sandals back in the day, and those sandals, they have two straps, one strap on the inside and one strap on the outside. So the Rabbanan said if either strap breaks, it's fine, because you could always switch feet over. It's more embarrassing to have the outer strap breaking, but you could always switch them over. It's not a big deal. And therefore, if one strap breaks, it will be totally fine. Whereas Rabbi Yehuda said, no, if the inner strap breaks, it's fine. It's not as embarrassing. But if the outer strap breaks, there's no such thing as switching it over. It cannot be done, and therefore the shoe will no longer be considered a shoe. That's true for two purposes. One, for the laws of Shabbos, meaning if your shoe is no longer considered a shoe, then it becomes muksa. And the other function is for tumah. If it's no longer considered a shoe, then it loses its status of being tameh. Right? That's what we saw yesterday. So again, Rabbanan say if one strap breaks, it's fine. You can just switch shoes. You can just switch feet. And Rabbi Yehuda says no. If it depends on which strap that breaks, sometimes it really does become no longer functional as a shoe, and again, therefore is muksa and or loses its status of tuma. We also saw yesterday that Rav Yochanan. Last thing we discussed was Rav Yochanan Rav Yochanan ruled like Rav Yehuda. Rav Yochanan ruled like Rav Yehuda, meaning that he would hold that if a strap on the outside breaks, it's no longer considered a shoe. Got it? Okay, so it says the Gemara. The Gemara challenges this idea, and we're going to spend most of the time discussing that, and some fascinating agadah as we continue. So, Umi Rav Yochanan Hachi. Does Rav Yochanan really say this? But Rav Yochanan, halachic sta Mishnah. We have a statement where Rav Yochanan says the halacha is always like an anonymous Mishnah. Meaning, when Rav Yehuda Hanasi organized the Mishnah, so Rav Yehuda Hanasi was the editor of the Mishnah, and so sometimes he would quote things in names of a certain person. He would say, Rabbi Kiva says this, Rabbi Yehuda says this, Rabbi Shmuel says this, and sometimes he would just say something. Stop. He would just put it as a statement. So Rav Yehuda Hanasi wrote the Mishnah. He never wrote like an introduction saying, this is why I structure certain things in certain ways. The Amoram come along later and tried to glean principles, try to figure out principles. And so Rav Yochanan comes along and says that Rav Yehuda Hanasi recorded something without attributing it to anyone, what we call a stam Mishnah, meaning it's anonymous, it just is said as a statement. The halacha is always like that opinion. That's the opinion. That's what Rav Yochanan says. Halacha kistam Mishnah. So whenever we have an anonymous Mishnah, it's not attributed to anyone. The reason Yehuda Hanasi does not attribute it to a particular person is to imply to us the halacha is like that Mishnah. So if that's the case, let's see. We're about to read a stam Mishnah, which seems to contradict what we just said. Utznan, we learned in the Mishnah, sandal shnipska achas mi'azda v'tikna, a sandal which one ear broke off, and the person repaired it. Tamei midras. Okay, it's still Tamei Midras. Okay, so meaning it still maintains its status as a shoe. If we say Tamei Midras, again, the principle we've seen over and over again in Masech Shabbos, if something is broken, something was Tamei, and then it breaks, right? Then if it fully breaks, it loses its status of being Tamei. But the fact that he says if one strap breaks off, and the person repairs it, it still maintains its Tuma, so that means that this is going like who? The Rabbanan or Rav Yehuda?
Could be either because it got fixed.
Well, granted, but the point is that even so the rules of Tumah is that if it breaks, even if you fix it later, once it broke, it no longer was a Kli. So this would seemingly go like the Rabbanan. The Rabbanan held that if one, right, Rabbi Yehuda said if one of them breaks, it still is Tahar, right? It still is the opposite. Right, the fact that it still is tamei, it implies that it's right. Rabbi Yehuda said if one of them breaks, then it no longer is tamei because it's no longer functional as a shoe. The fact that we say it still maintains its tuma goes like the Rabbanan who says you could switch shoes and therefore it's still tamei. So my lav, now the Gemara points out there's an assumption being made over here. My lav lo shna pnimis v'lo shna chitzona. The fact that the Mishnah said it's just straight implies that it doesn't matter if it's the inner or outer one. Remember, Rabbi Yehuda himself agrees if the outer strap breaks, then it will lose its status, right? So the Gemara assumes, based on the fact the Mishnah doesn't distinguish, that it doesn't matter if it's the outer one or the inner one. So the Gemara says, lo, pnimis dafka. You could reconcile this Mishnah with the opinion of Rabbi Yehuda by saying that it's the inner ear that broke off, the one that's less embarrassing, right? If you're walking and something on the inside is broken, it's less embarrassing, and therefore that is indeed the opinion of Rabbi Yehuda, and therefore we have no contradiction with Rabbi Yochanan, and this Mishnah, this Stam Mishnah, could be going like Rabbi Yehuda. The Gemara points out, though, it's actually problematic. Aval chitzona mai tahar. Because what's the implication? The implication is that if it's the outer ear that broke, the outer strap that broke, then it's going to be tar. It would no longer be functional. Ihachi, the Gemara asks, if that's so, adatani nifska shnia v'tikna, why does the Mishnah go on to say, if we don't have this in front of us, but the end of the Mishnah says that if both ears break off and the person fixes it, tahar mina midras, avaltame maga midras. Okay, then it loses its status of tumas midras. It still has some level of tumah, but the point is that it no longer is considered a utensil when both break off. The Gemara says, why do you give that example as the case that it loses its status as a shoe? Niflog b'dida. You should distinguish within the Mishnah, say, instead of saying, when it loses one, it's still tameh, when it loses two, it's tahar, say like this, niflag b'dida, differentiate within the same thing. Say, b'medvar murm shnifska pnimis, aval chitona tahar. The more, the sharper point to make is to say that if the inner one breaks off, then it's still a sandal, but if the outer one breaks off, then it's tahar. The fact that it doesn't do that implies that when it said that one breaks off and it's still considered a utensil, it doesn't matter if it's the inner one or the outer one, right? In other words, if the Mishnah is really going like Rabbi Yehuda, then why does the Mishnah distinguish between one strap and two straps? It should distinguish between outer strap and inner strap. The fact that it doesn't implies that when the Mishnah said that one strap broke off, it didn't matter if it was the outer one or the inner one. Either way, it's still going to be a shoe, which means it goes like the Rabbanan and not like Rabbi Yehuda, and now we're left with the question. We thought Rabbi Yochanan goes like Rabbi Yehuda, and yet this Mishnah, this Stam Mishnah, does not go like Rabbi Yehuda. So the Gemara gives a bit of a stretched answer, and acknowledges its stretched answer.
I just refuted it because the point we said before was that it would be the outer versus inner situation, and now we're saying that doesn't really make a difference because the whole premise is not that way.
Correct. In other words, if it was really a distinction between inner and outer, the Mishnah itself says, in one scenario of the shoe, it maintains its status of a shoe. In the other status, it loses its status of a shoe. Right? Now, if you're Rabbi Yehuda, what's the best, sharpest way to make that contrast? Say, if it loses the outer strap, the inner strap, then it's still going to be a shoe. If it loses the outer strap, it's going to lose its outer strap. But it doesn't do that. Instead, it says one strap versus two straps. It sounds like it's not like Rabbi Yehuda. That's the issue. So, Amar Rav Yitzchak Bar Yosef, Ben Yosef, Tehei, Mishnah Seinu, let our Mishnah be, Besandal Sheyesh Lo Arba Aznayim, Va'arba Tarsi Yosim. Okay, we're on 112b2. So we have an answer. It's a bit of a stretched answer, but the point is that there are cases, right? Until now, we've assumed we're talking about a sandal with one strap and one strap. But there are sandals, better sandals, sandals that many of us, that if you wear a sandal, I don't know, people still wear sandals, I guess so. Yeah, that basically is two straps and two straps, right? In other words, why are we assuming, or not why are we assuming? It's true, the standard sandal in the day was like, a single strap sandal. But the point is there are sandals with two straps on each side, right? They go like this. And if that's the case, then we could say that Shelo Lishbar Dvarav Shel Rav Yochanan in order to ensure that Rav Yochanan is consistent. Meaning, what are we saying now? The way to reconcile this Mishnah is to say that the Mishnah spoke about one strap, two straps. Both straps were on the outside, and what the Mishnah was saying is that when one strap on the outside breaks, it's still a shoe, because a person can still wear it. When both straps on the outside break, that's what it meant by two. It meant that's when it's no longer going to be. A shoe, and therefore you could read this Mishnah like Rabbi Yehuda, and therefore Rav Yochanan is consistently going like Rabbi Yehuda. All right, but the only way to do that is to assume we're no longer talking about a sandal with one strap. We're talking about a sandal with two straps, and it was saying basically one strap broken on the outside, nothing. Two straps broken on the outside, it loses its status as a shoe. Okay, now we're gonna fine. Good. Let's go a little further. Ki asa Ravin Amrav Chana Bar Abba Amarav Halacha Rav Yehuda. Okay, so we have a statement ultimately in the name of Rav saying the law is like Rav Yehuda. V'Rav Yochanan Amar. And then Ravin says in the name of Chana Bar Abba that Rav Yochanan says Ein Halacha Rav Yehuda. The halacha is not like Rav Yehuda. Okay, that's strange. We just spent all the past little, bunch of minutes trying to demonstrate that Rav Yochanan does hold like Rav Yehuda. As the Gemara points out, Amar Rav Yochanan Hachi, did Rav Yochanan really say the halacha is not like Rav Yehuda? V'hamid ben Tarch Rav Yochanan alibid Rav Yehuda. If you recall, this all started because yesterday we saw that Rav Yochanan had a issue with an earlier Mishnah, a different Mishnah, our Mishnah, the Mishnah of Masechah Shabbos, and ultimately explained it in accordance with Rav Yehuda. So on the one hand, we have Rav Yochanan explaining our Mishnah in accordance with Rav Yehuda. At the same time, we have the statements in the name of Ravin and the name of Rav Chanan Bar Abba in the name of Rav Yochanan saying that halacha is not like Rav Yehuda. Which one is it? Gemara says Amorai Ninhu V'Alibid Rav Yochanan. There are two divergent views among the Amoraim as to what Rav Yochanan said. Now, this is somewhat common with Rav Yochanan. It seems like there's certain Amoraim which had a lot of students. Maybe they were teaching at different times. I'm not so clear. But Rav Yochanan is one of the Amoraim which you find, I'm not going to say often, but more often than others, where you will have a couple of students of his, and one of them saying one one thing in his name, and one of them is saying a different thing in his name, and they're not always reconciled. And so over here we have two Amoraim, two different opinions within Rav Yochanan. In other words, it's not so clear to us now if Rav Yochanan does hold like Rav Yehuda, as we saw one Amora explain things earlier, or like this new opinion that we just saw now, that Rav Yochanan does not rule like Rav Yehuda. Okay, let's go a little bit further, and fine. Kol Tnan Hasam. We learned there in Maseches Kelim. Kol klei balei batim shiuran kirimonim. Whenever you have a utensil, again, we're going back to this rule that when a utensil breaks, if it breaks sufficiently, then it no longer is considered a utensil. So let's say you have this pot over here, which I'm holding. It looks like a tissue box, really it's a pot. And let's say there's a hole the size of a rimon. A rimon is a pomegranate, okay? So if there's a hole the size of a rimon, this thing is no longer functional. Makes sense? And therefore, if this thing was tameh, and then it has a hole the size of a rimon, the size of a pomegranate, this utensil will no longer be tameh. And even if I go and patch it up, which was pretty common back in the day, it lost its status of tumah. It's a new utensil. Okay? That's the principle. Okay? And so by Chizkiah asked the following question. Nikav kimotze zayis ustamo. Let's say this utensil developed a puncture the size of an olive, much smaller than a pomegranate. Okay? And then the person went ahead and sealed it. V'chazr nikav kimotze zayis ustamo. And then it developed another hole the size of an olive, and the person plugged it up. Actually, shlimo lemotze rimon, until there were enough holes, eventually it had so many holes that ultimately the sum total of all the holes was the size of a pomegranate. But never was one big hole the size of a pomegranate. Rather, it was one small hole, sealed it. One small hole, sealed it. One small hole, sealed it. And eventually you have enough of a hole the size of a pomegranate. What's the halacha? Does the tumah depart or not? Okay? Amalei Rav Yochanan. Rav Yochanan answered Chizkiah. Rebbe, my teacher, Chizkiah, Shanisan Lanu, you taught us the following halacha. Sandal shenifsika achas mi'aznav v'tikna. A sandal of which one ear broke off and the person fixed it. Tameh midras. It's still tameh, meaning it still has its status as a sandal. Nifska shnia v'tikna, but if the second ear broke, tahar mina midras, aval tameh maga midras. It loses its status of being tameh midras. It still has some level of tumah, but the point is, after the second one breaks, then it loses its status. Now, keep in mind the case is the guy has a shoe. One strap breaks, and the guy fixes it. Okay, puts in a new strap to fix it. And then after it gets fixed, the second one breaks and he fixes it. And still he says, even though it was never broken two at a time, he still says it loses its status as a shoe. So, so we asked you, Rabbi Yochanan says, we asked about this Mishnah. What's going on? Why is the first, when the first one breaks, does it still maintain its status as a shoe? Da kaima shnia. Because the second ear, the second strap, is still functional. Shnia nami misakin rishona. When the second one is being fixed, right? When the second one broke, the first one was already fixed. So it's the same thing. The Amraslan, and you Chizkiah told us, Alei, about this, panim chadashos ba'olakan. We treat it as, panim chadash is actually a phrase taken from, anybody? Sheva brachos. Okay, Sheva brachos, we have a rule that the only time you're able to say Sheva brachos if there's panim chadashos, literally means a new face, new people. So similarly over here, Chizkiah explains to Rav Yochanan, it's true that by the straps, when each strap broke, there was one other strap still intact. But the reason that we say that after both straps break, even though, again, the case is, one strap breaks, you fix it. Then the next strap breaks and you fix it, still we treat it like a new thing and it loses its tameh status. Why? Because at the end of the day, there are two new straps over here. It's called panim chadashos. So he says, so therefore it becomes a new thing. So achinami panim chadashos. Let's say about this utensil, it's the same thing, that even though an olive hole took place and you fixed it, then an olive hole took place and you fixed it, but the bottom line is, at the end of the day, there is enough newness over here, enough new patching, that it's treated like a new utensil, and therefore it's like a new face has come here, and therefore it is going to lose its status of tumah. Okay, so basically he wants to make that comparison. Yeah.
What's the measure? When is it? If it's all these different ones that combine, when do we get to the point where it loses that?
Never. It seems like we just keep that in mind forever.
No, I'm saying, but it loses its status at a certain point. Right? Because
when it reaches the measurement. Meaning, in this case, let's say it has an olive hole, patch, nothing. Olive hole, patch, nothing. But at some point, the pomegranate hole, that's when it reaches that threshold, similar to the two straps. Okay? So then Rav Chizkiah heard this answer by Rav Yochanan. He said, Kari alei, leis dain bar enish. This is not immortal. Right? He was very impressed with Rav Yochanan. He says he was a student at the time. Rav Yochanan ultimately became like a great teacher. But at this point, Rav Yochanan was a student of Chizkiah, and he says, Rav Yochanan, this my student Yochanan, he is not a human, right? He's off the charts. Okay? Iked Amri kigon dain bar enesh. Another way of saying it is that this guy is a human. This is a real, a model of what a person is. Okay, fine. Two different ways of saying it, and because we just quoted this idea of comparing Rav Yochanan to a human, we now quote a very somewhat well-known statement, which needs a little bit of explaining, and that is as follows. We're on 112b3. Amar Rav Zera, Amar Rava bar Zimona. Im Rishonim b'nei Malachim. Rav Zera said, if the early ones, if the scholars of the previous generations were considered b'nei malachim, like the sons of angels, that was their stature, anu b'nei anashim, we are considered the sons of men. In other words, we've gone down in status. If you want to compare the earlier scholars to people calling them like the sons of angels, then we are considered the sons of mortals. V'mishonim b'nei anashim, and if you want to tell me the earlier ones were compared to sons of men, that's their status. Anu kachamorim, we are like donkeys. And when I say donkey, I don't mean these famous donkeys. Rav Pinchas ben Yair, Rav Chanina ben Dosa both had donkeys. There are stories in the Gemara about them not transgressing Shabbos. Or the Gemara, one story is where one of them sold his donkey to a non-Jew, and on Shabbos the non-Jew wanted his donkey to do work, and the donkey refused to do work. Okay, so that's not a stam donkey, right? So, when we say donkeys, we mean like other people. This is one of the famous Gemaras that speak about the concept that is known as what? As Yiridas Hadoros, as the fact that over time we have gone down in stature. That the further we are from Har Sinai, the further we are from the receiving of the Torah, we have gone down in status. I would just point out Rav Kook has a beautiful piece. Actually, on Masech Shabbos earlier on when we had a Gemara about the Machlokas Hillel and Shammai about how you light the Hanukkah candles, right? One says you go up, Hillel, that's our approach, and Shammai says you go down. Rav Kook says they're not arguing. He has a number of different approaches. One of them he says they're not arguing. And what's going on over here? That Shammai, they're each focusing, the lights over here, the lights seem to be focused holiness. One of them says the holiness is going up. One of them says the holiness is going down. That seems right. You start at 8, go to 7, go to 6, go to 5. That seems to imply like Shammai says the holiness is diminishing. And Hillel seems to be saying the holiness is increasing. He says they're not arguing at all. He says Shammai is focusing, and it's not coincidental that Shammai is always seen as like a bit of an elitist and a bit of a, focused on more of an ideal state. He's focusing on the scholars and the leaders of the generation. When it comes to leaders of the generation, there is Yeridas Adoros, which is exactly what Rav Zera is saying. Rav Zera is saying, the Chachamim, if you look closely, meaning this statement is oftentimes quoted about, in general, there's Yeridas Adoros. Rav Kook says, no. Rav Zera is a Chacham. And he's saying if we, the scholars, are like, earlier generation are like people, then we are like donkeys. Saying when it comes to leadership, when it comes to scholars, that's when there is Yeridas Adoros, there is a diminishment of light. But when it comes to the masses, that's what Hillel is focusing on. Hillel is saying when it comes to the masses, it starts with one and it's gone up with time. If anything, and the truth is, we sometimes have these like idealized pictures of the shtetl and everyone walking around learning nonstop. It's not entirely accurate. It's fair. I think it's much more accurate to say that in this day and age, the amount of learning, just even think over the past few decades, or maybe in time, I think of the past year, but the amount of learning has actually increased. And when it comes to leadership, there is a Yeridas Adoros, there is a diminishment of light, there is a lessening of stature. When it comes to the masses, there is an increase in light, and the light goes higher and higher. And therefore, again, this statement is specifically said in the context of the leaders. When it comes to the masses, to recognize we're part of a growth, an incredible exponential growth of regular people, that we are coming higher and higher. Okay, I've always found that piece of Cook to be very uplifting. Okay, so let's go a little bit further. We had our Mishnah said that on Shabbos, person's allowed to tie the top of a canteen of wine or oil. V'nodos yain v'shemen. And the Gemara says pshita. Obviously, you're allowed to tie this not on Shabbos. Wine, oil, you're going to be opening up and closing it. Meaning it's not a permanent knot. It's something which is open and closed all the time. So the Gemara says lo tzricha de islay tarte une. No, the reason it's novel is because the canteen, this wine or oil canteen, has 2 flaps. Okay, I would have thought a person will leave one knot tied permanently and pour the wine or oil out of the second opening. In other words, there's 2 open. You could theoretically slip things out of one opening. You don't have to open them both. Kamash Malan says no. Bottom line is you don't have to be concerned about that, and as long as the person doesn't plan on keeping these knots tied all the time, then tying these knots is permissible. Right? We saw the same type of principle earlier by the woman's shirt. Similar Kader Shal Basar. The Mishnah said that a knot over a pot of meat. Right? Then back in the day, they didn't have like Tupperware. Rather, what they did is they put their meat into like a big bag and they tied it. That's basically what they did. So pshita, obviously, you're going to be getting the meat out. Of course, it's not a permanent knot. Lo tzricha de islay shlacha. We're talking about a case where the pot has a spout. So granted, it's tied, but you may not untie it because it has a little spout that you could pour things out of. Therefore, the person's going to keep the knot tied permanently. Kamash B'lam, we're not afraid the person's going to do so, even though it has a spout, and therefore tying this pot of meat is fine. Okay, Rav Eliezer ben Yaakov Omer, kosher, and Rav Eliezer ben Yaakov says you're allowed to tie a rope in front of an animal in order that it not go out. Pshita, Gemara says also it's obvious. It's clear the person is going to be opening and closing it. They're going to want their animal to get out and in. So l'tzricha de islay tarte esar. We're talking about a case where the stall has two ropes, one above the other. Ma'odatema, I would have thought, the person would think, you'd think that a person's going to leave one tied permanently, and they can only, and then release the other one. Kamashman, we could assume that the person's going to untie both of them. Okay, Amar Rav Yosef, Amar Yehuda, Amar Shmuel, halacha Rav Eliezer ben Yaakov. He says halacha follows Rav Eliezer ben Yaakov, this last opinion. So Amar le Abaye says, these lines should sound familiar. Halacha miklal de pligi. If you say the halacha is like Rav Yehuda, Amar Shmuel, like Rav Eliezer ben Yaakov, that implies that the Tanakama, even though he didn't say so explicitly, it must be that he argues. So Amar le, my nafka mina. What do you care if the Tanakhama argues? At the end of the day, I'm telling you the halacha is like Rav Eliezer ben Yaakov. So what does he say? And we saw this earlier. Amar le, Abaye says to his teacher, to Rav Yosef, Gemara is Marta to hey. Do you want me to be learning a song? Just review, just blindly, just absentmindedly remembering the words. I want to have a deeper understanding. And if the Chachamim disagreed, I want to understand why they disagreed, even if we don't rule like them. Right, it's important, right, and this goes back to so much of all of the different opinions we have in the Gemara. So often we just like, hey, you space out for the entire Amud or the entire Daf. Like, what's the bottom line halacha? Like, could I tie garbage? Can I not tie garbage? And Abaye, and that's Rav Yosef's approach. Abaye is saying no. He says there's value in actually knowing all the opinions, even those we reject, because learning Torah is not just like reminding, just like teaching ourselves a song, like learning all the lyrics. And I just want to know the bottom line. We want to have the depth. We want to really understand it deeply, and therefore there's value not just knowing the bottom line, which is important, but also knowing the opinions, even those that we don't go like, because that is important to us as well. Have a wonderful day.